Hello and welcome to the launch of the Global Organised Crime Index. My name is Tuesday Raytano, the Deputy Director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, and I'll be your moderator for this event. The goal of the Global Initiative is to enhance analysis of, encourage action against, and support resilience to organised crime in order to mitigate its impact on people, the environment, businesses, and states. With our 500-strong global network of experts and our almost 100 staff, this is the heart of what we work towards every single day. But today we're very glad to have you with us for the launch of a very special initiative for the GI, the launch of our first ever Global Organised Crime Index. To open our presentation, I'd like to give the floor to our director, Mark Shaw.
Thank you, Tuesday. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the launch of the Global Organised Crime Index. Since the GI was created, we've worked hard to build a platform to promote greater debate and innovative approaches towards organised crime, towards a more inclusive global strategy against the phenomenon. 8 years later, we are pleased to present what we believe will be an extremely innovative and insightful tool that is in line with the organization's goal. Organised crime poses a significant threat to peace and security, both at the national and international level. It serves as a spoiler for sustainable development, including in the areas of public health, economic stability, and governance. But organised crime is, of course, not a new phenomenon, though it is now a more urgent issue to address than ever. In a globalized world, organised crime has transcended borders, touching every corner of the globe, driven by geopolitical, economic, and technological forces, and adapting to different conditions and environments. In order to address this phenomenon that has reached global proportions, it is first imperative that we come to understand the problem more effectively. And the index is the first of its kind, an expert-led tool designed to assess levels of organised crime and, importantly, resilience to organised criminal activity across the 193 countries that are UN member states. It provides the most comprehensive assessment to date of the pervasiveness of criminal markets, the influence of criminal actors, and the effectiveness of resilience measures to combat the organised crime threat. The 2021 Global Organised Crime Index sets out the results and implications of the 2020 data. It was, of course, the year in which a new pandemic began to ravage the world. And organised criminal actors once again adapted to this challenge, and new illicit markets emerged. But just as the pandemic underscored the necessity of global collaboration, the same can be said for organised crime as a truly global threat that requires a truly global response. The index will be updated every 2 years, providing a global baseline assessment of criminality and resilience over time. Our intention is that it will become a consistent and comprehensive resource that contextualizes and interprets evolving organised crime dynamics. The results of the index point to a number of implications that will contribute to better policy making and building effective systemic responses to organised crime at national, regional, and international levels. We hope you find the event thought-provoking and informative, and you can, of course, read the full report on our interactive website. Back to you, Tuesday.
The Global Index is the product of many years of development by our team, which began with the Norwegian and EU-funded Organised Crime Index for Africa, launched under the ENACT programme, a consortium with the Institute for Security Studies and Interpol, and which was published for the first time in 2019. With the generous support of the United States Department of State, we have since built on that model and taken the index global. I'd like to welcome Mr. Barry Fullerton, Director for Global Programs and Policy in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs at the US Department of State, to give us some opening remarks.
Thank you, Tuesday, Mark. Good afternoon, good evening, and to those who are in the United States with me today, good morning. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to join you today at the official public launch of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime's Global Organized Crime Index. On behalf of the US government, and specifically the US Department of State, I would like to express my gratitude to the Global Initiative, to Mark, Tuesday and the others for your partnership on this important 2-year effort to develop a tool to analyze levels of crime and resilience in all 193 UN member states. I'm here today to represent a part of the State Department that you may know called the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, or INL. INL has long recognized that crime is increasingly transnational. Assisting other countries to counter crime abroad helps us at home in the United States and across the entire global community. To respond, we leverage foreign assistance programs and bilateral and multilateral diplomatic engagement programs that advance our shared interests in promoting public safety and security. Transnational criminal networks exploit fragile countries, areas where the fabric of the rule of law is weaker, or where they can count on official cover, places where they can operate with relative impunity, but no country is immune to their influence or impact. The Global Initiative's Organized Crime Index helps countries assess vulnerabilities and resilience to organized crime in a quantitatively based and expert-led way. This index is the result of collaborative efforts, as you already heard from Tuesday, with over 350 experts worldwide, members of the Global Initiative's network of experts, and many other independent journalists, academics, researchers, and members of civil society. The international community is entering a critical phase in the fight against transnational organized crime. And today's public launch of this index will be the starting point of a new global dialogue. It will provide the data on which to build an international coordinated response to more effectively combat transnational organized crime. It is imperative that we work together to find practical solutions to such crime, focusing on greater information sharing across our borders, stronger and more effective capacity building programs, and greater use of tools like this index to promote international cooperation. We are thankful today to the Global Initiative for hosting and organizing this important event, and for its leadership in serving as a platform to promote greater debate and innovative approaches to combating transnational organized crime globally. Thank you very much. I look forward to the program today. Back to you, Tuesday.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you very much to the US government for their support. Last year, COVID-19 threw the world into disarray. Almost 2 million people died in 2020 alone. It brought upheaval, crisis, and change. The criminal underworld was not excluded from this. Some illicit activities were hindered by restrictions imposed during the outbreak. But just as the virus destroyed some opportunities, it provided space for others to emerge, and new means of criminal exploitation presented themselves. Much like the COVID-19 virus, criminality mutated, adapting to obstacles put in place by the pandemic, and started to thrive. Cybercrime in particular boomed. Drug traffickers found new ways of transporting their contraband. Border closures froze human smuggling networks, and the economic downturn made people more vulnerable to human trafficking and exploitation, usury, and loan sharking. Criminal gangs sought to strengthen their foothold in the communities in which they operate too. But the pandemic isn't the only factor that impacted organized crime in 2020. Events in the upper world, in the licit economy, in society, in politics, all shape the actions of the underworld. Here are some, but by no means all, of the events that influenced the shape of the global illicit economy and organized crime groups in 2020.
The start of 2020 was marked by the identification of the novel coronavirus in Wuhan, China. Shortly after, on the 15th of January, the police in Sicily arrested 94 people, including alleged mafia members, following a large-scale EU agricultural subsidies fraud. 2 mafia groups were said to have obtained at least 5.5 million euros in EU farm subsidies for land they didn't own. The Dawn raids were said to be one of the largest police operations focused on the Cosa Nostra. The United Kingdom left the European Union at the end of January, raising concerns of its impact on the ability to collaborate with the EU on security issues, including illicit cross-border flows. In February, the Brazilian President Bolsonaro sent a bill to Congress that would open the country's indigenous reserves in the Amazon to commercial mining. Violence against land defenders and indigenous people has become an increasing concern in recent years, especially in Latin America and Asia. At the end of February, US officials negotiated an agreement with the Taliban to end the 18-year war in Afghanistan. Western troops withdrew, and the Taliban escalated their activity to take territorial control. Afghanistan is the world's largest producer of heroin, and the Taliban are known to be involved in this trade by taxing illicit goods in production areas, and further insecurity could boost the opportunities for trafficking groups. In March, the World Health Organization officially declared the COVID-19 outbreak as a pandemic.
Use the word pandemic.
Illicit actors took advantage of new opportunities afforded by the pandemic, including the sale of fake PPE by creating fraudulent websites and the hacking of furlough schemes. 1 week later, oil prices fell to a 17-year low, largely due to a decline in demand from industries stalling as a result of the pandemic. And in April, US crude oil fell below zero for the first time in history, following a global economic slump. This had a knock-on effect on organized crime, as there was less financial incentive for criminal actors to engage with the oil industry. But instead of reducing crime, this is likely to have motivated them to find other sources of illicit income. The collapse in oil also brought about a boom in floating oil storage, leaving many ships carrying oil cargo vulnerable to piracy. In May, China launched the first of several incursions into the Indian territory of Ladakh. Border disputes inevitably affect cross-border trade, both formal and informal. From May 2020, George Floyd's murder sent a tidal wave of protests across the US and beyond, sparking a crucial debate on the issues of race, inequality, and the relationship between law enforcement and marginalized communities. On the 5th of June, Brazil's Supreme Court announced a ban on police raids in Rio de Janeiro's favelas. Deadly police incursions into Brazil's favelas were not a new phenomenon, and the move came after the police killings increased significantly in the first 4 months of 2020 in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. These broader societal issues provide a lens through which to examine responses to organized crime, particularly in places where there is a disconnect between police and citizens. Later that month, the UN published a report calling for an investigation into abuses committed in the context of President of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs. Since Duterte came into power in 2016, it's estimated that 27,000 people have been killed in anti-drug operations. At the start of July, European law enforcement agencies announced the dismantling of EncroChat, an encrypted messaging service used by criminals. It resulted in 800 initial arrests and the seizures of substantial volumes of cash, drugs, and weapons. In August, a devastating explosion in Lebanon destroyed the port of Beirut, killing 217 people and displacing over 300,000. It prompted major anti-government protests. Investigations that followed showed that the explosion was not only a result of inadequate control measures, but also a toxic mix of opaque offshore structures, impunity, and troublesome sectarian politics. A few months after the dismantling of EncroChat, documents revealing the astronomical sums of money laundered in the global financial system were leaked. The so-called FinCEN files. It shone a light on the use of international banking systems by oligarchs and criminals across the globe. And the next day, the Trump administration imposed economic sanctions on Iran following the US withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. With these sanctions, long-standing smuggling networks can benefit from the increased need for basic goods and other commodities that are either too expensive or cannot be legally obtained. On the 4th of November, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed ordered a military offensive against regional forces in Tigray. Across Africa, conflict and instability were unimpeded by the pandemic, with armed attacks, government offensives, and insurgencies, and creating opportunities for arms and people trafficking in the region. On the 2nd of December, the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs voted to remove cannabis from Schedule 4 of the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. While the move is unlikely to have any material impact on illicit markets, it does represent a shift in attitudes towards the substance, paving the way for further reform. And on the 6th of December, President Nicolas Maduro's party won legislative elections in Venezuela, which were boycotted by all main opposition parties. The country has become a key hub for illicit flows of arms and people, and while the political crisis shows no sign of abating, the country's instability is a key enabler of organized criminal activity, not only in Venezuela itself, but it also risks destabilizing other fragile states in Latin America and the Caribbean.
These events are, of course, by no means an exhaustive list, but they are illustrative of the way that the illicit economy is interwoven with key geopolitical events of the year. You can take a look at the full timeline in the 2021 Global Initiative Index report. All over the world, organized crime poses a major security threat, and this is made even more fragile by a lack of resilience to organized crime. Illicit economies and criminal actors are a transnational threat, which demand a global response. Countries must work together to help prevent and slow the damage caused by the illicit economy and criminal actors. The Global Organized Crime Index aims to improve our understanding of how this could be achieved. Focusing on criminality alone limits our view of the organized crime landscape. Countries may have similar scores for criminality, but it's how they approach this problem that matters the most. By also considering how robust a country's framework and capacity is to respond, the index takes a much more rounded and balanced view. And while the precise relationship between criminality and resilience cannot yet be seen, we hope that with subsequent iterations, the index will allow us to better understand these dynamics over time and be used as the tool to galvanize political will and increase global awareness of the threat. Without these elements, we cannot hope to have an impact against a problem this vast. Now let's have a look at some of the key findings from the index in 2020.
More than 3/4 of the world's population live in countries with high levels of criminality and countries with low levels of resilience to organized crime. 79.2% of the world's population live in countries with high levels of criminality, and 79.4% of the world's population live in countries with low levels of resilience. This doesn't mean that a large population size is a determining factor of criminality. It is a matter of how many people are impacted by organized crime. It underscores the ubiquity of organized crime and the urgent need to implement measures to combat it. Asia has the highest levels of criminality, closely followed by Africa and the Americas. To an extent, this is not surprising. Asia is the most populous continent. It is rich in natural resources and home to some of the world's largest economic powerhouses. Western Asia is a notoriously fragile region in which several countries have experienced or are experiencing either conflict or its immediate impact over the past decade. However, this is the only region in Asia that scores in the top 5 regions globally for criminality. This underscores the importance of breaking down the analysis into sub-regions to accurately identify where harms are being felt. Human trafficking is the most pervasive of all criminal markets globally, followed by the cannabis trade, arms trafficking, human smuggling, and wildlife crimes. The ubiquity of the human trafficking market is based on the dehumanizing reality that all over the world, people are subjects of exploitation, and that exploitation comes in many forms. Democracies have higher levels of resilience to criminality than authoritarian states. Countries categorized as full democracies on average exhibit higher levels of resilience than authoritarian states. Good governance sets the foundation on which to build and strengthen institutional and non-state frameworks to better society and counter organized crime. State actors are the most dominant agents in facilitating illicit economies and inhibiting resilience to organized crime. 2020 was marked by a number of high-level corruption scandals in various parts of the world which embroiled holders of political office. While the degree to which criminality has permeated state institutions varies from low-level corruption to full state capture, they are nonetheless the most dominant type of criminal actor in the world. Inevitably, this has implications for countries' ability to respond to organized crime. Many countries in conflict and fragile states are acutely vulnerable to organized crime. Countries with the highest criminality levels are those experiencing conflict, insecurity, or fragility. The Democratic Republic of Congo was identified as the country most affected by organized crime, followed by Colombia, Myanmar, Mexico, and Nigeria. In conflict settings, the attention and capacities of the state may be diverted to war efforts, leaving social, economic, and security institutions weakened, while resilience to organized crime declines.
As you've seen, the Global Organized Crime Index reveals a number of insights into criminal markets, criminal actors, and resilience dynamics, both within national borders and transnationally. Laura Adal, senior analyst with us at the Global Initiative, who's been leading the development of the index, will talk us through some of these findings in more detail.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Adal, and as Tuesday mentioned, I'm a senior analyst at the Global Initiative and the lead of the Core Index team. And today we're very pleased to be presenting to you the first ever Global Organized Crime Index. I'll be going over a brief overview of the tool's structure and methodology, along with speaking a bit more about the index findings and implications, including those that have been highlighted in the video that you've just seen. Now, I'd like to start off by saying that beyond the multiple ways in which users can analyze and compare data and information under the index, above all, our aim in developing this tool is to use it as a conversation starter, to move forward the global discourse surrounding organized crime and promote more innovative ways in responding to it, and potentially, with future iterations of the tool, offer a predictive function of this constantly evolving threat. So the index not only measures organized crime and related issues, but also assesses countries' resilience to organized crime, looking at both sides of the coin and recognizing that criminality and resilience are interrelated, and that the value of the tool is enhanced when we look at both sets of dynamics. The tool captures criminality by evaluating two components. First, the scope and scale of 10 criminal markets, and second, the structure and influence of 4 criminal actor typologies. At the same time, in assessing resilience, the index evaluates the existence and effectiveness of 12 what we call building blocks of resilience. So for each of the 193 countries in the world, 2 scores are assigned. First, countries are led by their criminality score, comprising criminal markets and actors. And second, countries are assigned the resilience score. Now, focusing only on criminality for a moment, with criminal markets, the index looks at 10 distinct criminal markets. And while each acts as a standalone indicator, we can generally group these 10 markets into 4 broad categories. So first, we have the people-based markets, covering human trafficking and smuggling, the trade markets, in this case arms trafficking, environmental crime markets, and finally, 4 drug markets. For criminal actors, what we've done is come up with 4 actor types, recognizing that not all criminals will always fall neatly into one category or another. So the index evaluates, first, mafia-style groups. And so these are groups with known names, defined leadership, and that typically control territory. And here we often include groups like militias and terrorist groups that regularly engage in criminal acts to fund their activities. Second, criminal networks. So these are more loosely based networks of criminal associates engaging in criminal activities. Third, state-embedded actors. And these are criminal actors embedded in and acting from within the state apparatus. And finally, fourth, foreign criminal actors. In other words, any actor, including state and non-state criminal actors that are operating outside of their home countries. Now, turning to resilience, the index looks at the types of mechanisms that countries have in place to combat organized crime and the effectiveness of these measures. Like criminality indicators, each resilience building block is a standalone indicator of resilience. But nevertheless, general categories do appear, reflecting the political, legal, criminal justice, economic, and social spheres of society that, when taken together, have the potential to provide holistic and sustainable responses to organized crime. Now, all indicators under the overarching criminality and resilience components are scored on a scale of 1 to 10. For the criminality component, a score of 1 represents the best possible scenario, where the illicit market or criminal actor type does not exist. And a score of 10 represents the worst possible scenario, where the illicit market or criminal actor type has an extremely effective negative influence on all parts of society and/or state structures. By contrast, for the 12 resilience indicators, that 1 to 10 scale is flipped. So a score of 1 represents the worst possible scenario. In other words, the resilience measure does not exist. And a score of 10 represents the best possible scenario. In other words, where the resilience measure exists and is extremely effective. Now, one qualifier I'd like to note is that it's not enough that a resilience measure exists and is effective in responding to organized crime. In this sense, we also look at the vehicle of implementation to determine whether resilience measures are put into place in such a way so as to meet international human rights standards. Taken as a whole, each criminality and resilience indicator is weighted equally, recognizing that, of course, there is implicit weighting in the index structure. One thing that is important to note on scoring for both criminality and resilience is because of the way the index is structured, countries that have more diverse criminal markets, for example, will have higher scores than countries that may have just 1 or 2 extremely pervasive market or actor. And again, this is just because of how the index calculates scores by taking a simple average of all indicators to come up with a final overall score. Now, the actual scoring for the index was an iterative process where initial research was carried out to create a preliminary profile for every country in the world, highlighting background information for each of the 26 criminality and resilience indicators. These profiles were then reviewed, amended, and scored anonymously and independently through a series of thematic and geographic expert reviews. Input from these rounds were then consolidated, and profiles then went through a series of evaluations to make sure scores were calibrated for regional and eventually global comparisons. In the end, over 5,000 indicators were scored and reviewed, with the process relying on over 350 experts, underscoring just the collective effort to develop a product that is comprehensive, accurate, and truly global. And so the culmination of these efforts has produced a wealth of knowledge and a number of noteworthy and hopefully thought-provoking results, not least of which is the fact that the majority of the world's population, nearly 80%, live in conditions where criminality is pervasive and resilience is not sufficient, as the video showed. And while countries with particularly acute problems of criminality may not necessarily be the same ones as those with low resilience, what we find is that populations that live in areas where there are high incidents of organized crime become more vulnerable. And when organized crime targets the vulnerable, its impact ultimately spreads to society as a whole, leaving little room for formal, legal, and legitimate activities to take place. Now, this does not necessarily mean that population size for any given country is a determining factor for levels of criminality. For example, while it is true that Asia was found to be the continent with the highest levels of organized crime, And it is indeed the largest continent in terms of land size and population. When you break those results down by geography, only one sub-region of Asia, Western Asia, is in the top 10 highest scoring regions across the world. And when you break down those same criminality results by component, while Asia may have the highest criminal market score, it's actually both the Americas and Africa that host the most influential criminal actors. And so again, it's quite important to remember that the different ways the index can be used to help us identify dynamics both at a macro and more granular level. Now, when there is something to exploit, we know that organized crime finds a way to exploit it. And we saw very clear examples of that against the backdrop of COVID-19. Traditionally, when we think of the most potent criminal markets, it's often those that trade in highly prized or rare commodities. But in reality, the pervasiveness of markets tend to revolve around the things that are the most available and versatile. And this is perhaps nowhere more true than when we talk about the exploitation of human beings themselves. One of the key index findings is that human trafficking with a score of 5.58 out of 10 was not only identified as the highest scoring criminal market worldwide, as the video pointed out, but when the results were broken down, we found that it also featured in the top 5 criminal markets on every single continent. Now, why is that? Well, of course, humans themselves are unfortunately the subjects of exploitation, but also because their exploitation comes in many forms, from forced labor to organ trafficking and sex trafficking. And because such exploitation encompasses a range of illicit activities, they can occur in any and every country in the world, rich and poor, big and small. Now, the same principles for the pervasiveness of the human trafficking market could be said for other high-scoring illicit activities. Let's take the drugs market, for example. The cannabis trade was identified as being the second highest-scoring market worldwide, reaching an estimated 200 million users globally in 2019, and far more pervasive than the cocaine, heroin, and synthetic drugs trade. But why is that? Well, one explanation can be that while those other narcotics could be the dominant in some source countries, their high cost and the preference for other drugs in some user markets may contribute to their limited prevalence globally. When we compare that to cannabis, we know that cannabis can be cultivated in a range of environments and is comparatively cheap. And since the pandemic began, we know that studies have come out showing the decline in the consumption of party drugs, or those frequently taken in social settings like cocaine and MDMA due to lockdowns and other restrictions, while also seeing a rise in cannabis to combat anxiety and depression amid the pandemic. And so we see these principles of product availability and versatility apply to other markets that can contribute to their pervasiveness, along with a range of different variables. Now, as we've mentioned, criminal markets make up only one aspect of the index criminality score. And by exploring the dynamics of criminal actors, index gives us insight into how criminality is perpetrated. For instance, even though criminal networks can generally be thought of as the conduits of illicit flows within a country and transnationally, in fact, it was state-embedded actors that were identified as the dominant criminal actor type worldwide, with a global average of 5.76 out of 10. And this is particularly troubling because what it tells us is that in many cases, the very apparatus that is meant to be the driving force to counter organized crime may even perpetuate criminal activities. Now, we recognize that the degree of state involvement in illicit activities occurs on a spectrum, from low-level corruption to full-on state capture, in which the state apparatus is the predominant and often sole perpetrator of illegitimate violence and crime. And of course, the implications of this finding not only impacts countries' criminality, but also reflects countries' resilience to the organized crime threat. So what about resilience? Well, most often what we saw in the resilience results was that while many countries had the necessary frameworks in place showing an expressed desire to combat organized crime, implementation was lacking. For example, resilience indicators like international cooperation and national policies and laws scored the highest among the 12 building blocks, with global scores of 5.68 and 5.42 respectively. By contrast, economic and social resilience indicators scored significantly lower on average. Of course, the state is only one source of resilience to organized crime. And fortunately, we found that non-state actors, including the media and civil society, scored comparatively high across the 12 building blocks. Non-state actors were often found in many countries to be the strongest or only responders to organized crime, sometimes operating in highly restricted contexts and where state institutions engage in or further criminal activities. At the other end of the spectrum, the indicator for government transparency and accountability represented the second lowest average at a 4.41 across all 12 resilience building blocks. So what are the barriers to countries' resilience to organized crime? Of course, what makes a country more or less vulnerable to organized crime is an extremely complex subject to study. And while the index provides a standardized way to evaluate criminality and resilience across a spectrum of environments, what we've acknowledged right from the start of the creation of this tool is that in analyzing organized crime, states start off on unequal footing, often through no fault of their own. We know that organized crime is everywhere, but how it looks in any given place is dependent on a range of distinct circumstances. Like criminality, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to resilience, and so no assumptions can be made about what makes a country resilient. Now, for criminality, we've said things like population size aren't necessarily linked to levels of criminality, but are there any similar relationships we can pull out for resilience? What the index has found is that governance does influence countries' resilience to organized crime. For example, another key finding that the video highlights is that countries categorized as full democracies, on average, exhibited higher levels of resilience than authoritarian states, with a strong correlation between the EIU's 2020 Democracy Index and the Global Index Resilience scores. In fact, 4 out of the top 5 countries with the highest resilience were also in the top 10 countries of the 2020 Democracy Index. At the other end of the resilience spectrum, 82% of countries with the 20 lowest resilience scores were categorized as authoritarian states. We know that states that are participatory, accountable, effective, and founded in the rule of law provide a foundation on which to build state and non-state frameworks that can counter organized crime. In some authoritarian contexts, organized crime as a state function may leave little room for other criminal groups to operate, while in other instances, a state may franchise out its monopoly over resources in criminal markets to other criminal groups who act on its behalf. Another factor, such as conflict and instability, was not only linked to criminality, where the highest scoring countries were those experiencing conflict and fragility, as the video pointed out, but also to resilience, where a strong negative correlation was found. In conflict settings, state attention is diverted to war efforts, which inevitably leaves social, economic, and security institutions weakened. Similarly, in conflict settings, when there's a dispute over territory or resources, territorial control and social cohesion are likely to be diminished. And so all of these circumstances can lead to an overall decline in the resilience to organized crime. But as we pull out these correlations, I'd like to take a step back and point out that the message here is not that rich and stable democracies are void from organized crime. In fact, far from it. It's important to keep in mind that first finding I mentioned, that organized crime is everywhere. It may just look different from country to country. But what the results show it is that in transparent and open societies, where checks and balances are in place and where civil society, the media, and everyday citizens enjoy high levels of freedom to pursue legitimate livelihoods and hold to account those that engage in criminality, vulnerability to organized crime tends to decline. So first and foremost, it is essential that the scale of the organized crime phenomenon is recognized. And once that happens, we can begin to take the necessary steps to address it based on a robust evidence base to which the Global Index contributes. This includes working towards ending the impunity of state-embedded actors to increase resilience, peace building, and bolstering democratic values in the rule of law. The index highlights these differences in organized crime, but does so in a systematic and measurable way through both a geographic and thematic lens. And so we encourage you all to visit our interactive website at ocindex.net and read the 2021 report that speaks to these issues and much more. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. One of our main ambitions in developing the index was to provide a solid evidence basis upon which policymakers can design effective tailor-made response measures to address criminality in their respective countries and regions. The index not only highlights room for improvement, but also shows us where successful measures against organized crime have been implemented. While individual scores and conclusions may be disputed, the process of score interrogation and reflection is part of the overall dialogue that the index aims to achieve, and we hope will serve to build consensus and agreement around priorities for action. We have shared our report with a number of policymakers, academics, and civil society members to hear what they think about how the index can be utilized going forward.
The Organized Crime Index will be of interest to many who are trying to get a grip on understanding how organized crime affects states and how it operates internationally. Especially interesting to me was to understand through the data that the index has how central the problem of conflict is to organized crime in many regions around the world. It is also key in understanding how resilient states are to the problem of organized crime, and it shows that states that are more democratic are much more resilient to organized crime. I especially appreciated the attention that was paid in the index to the growing problem of environmental and natural resource crime, and how this is becoming an ever more central piece of the organized crime problem. And I think it is also key to understand how weak states and corrupt leaders and state involvement in organized crime are key to the perpetuation of the problem. Therefore, I think that the index, which is a numerical and geographical index, also manages to capture many of the subtleties and variations of organized crime across the world and communicates it in a very accessible fashion to people who are not specialists, but also provides many insights to specialists as well.
Hello from Hong Kong. I'm Karen Laidler, Director of the Center for Criminology at the University of Hong Kong. I'd like to take this opportunity to say a few words about the Global Organized Crime Index created by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. The Global Organized Crime Index 2021 is the first initiative ever to establish a tool for taking stock and assessing the nature, extent, and impact of the major crime markets, the criminal actors who shape and influence the character of these markets, and country responses and resilience to these markets. This multidimensional lens on organized crime is innovative and valuable, as it not only helps to identify the dominant markets and groups, but provides the counterweight of how state and non-state actors and groups are able or not able to push back at the harms created from organized crime. There is certainly a great deal to learn from this index and the analysis of global, regional, and country trends. Living in and observing from Asia, I'm particularly struck by the fact that globally, almost 80% of the world population live in countries with high levels of criminality. Moreover, Asia is very much part of this fact, as it has the highest level of criminality overall, given that it is the most populated continent, abundant in natural resources, and has an exceptionally strong economic base. Yet the index's ability to go beyond the broad regional to sub-regional or country-specific focus shows us that there are differences within the region. For the region as a whole, human trafficking and synthetic drugs trade are the first and second main criminal markets in Asia and have lower resilience scores than other regions. When breaking this down into the 5 sub-regions, there are significant differences in the market's criminal actors and resilience measures. Importantly, these findings are contextualized in the report with a review of what is referenced as the major global events shaping organized crime over 2020, including COVID, which remains with us today. This tool provides a fantastic foundation for understanding global trends in the transnational dynamics of organized crime, comparing within and across regions, and on the nearly 200 countries included in the analysis. This foundation serves as a field for exploration today, planning for tomorrow, and no doubt will become a permanent fixture for future research and policy making.
Let me start my remarks by thanking the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime for inviting me to make a statement on this occasion of the launching of the Global Organized Crime Index 2021. The Global Crime Index is a watershed in the history of actions against global organized crime. It is the first of its kind, and it is indeed very rich and far-reaching. But what is even more important in the report is the fact that the report has tried to do away with a number of myths. For example, with regards to human trafficking, being one of the most prevalent organized crime in the world. Also with regards to organized crime prevalence in the different parts of the world. In particular, what was discovered in Africa is startling. But what is critical in all of this is the fact that the impact of organized crime is not likely to be the same across the world. In some regions with higher resilience, it is quite easy for them to deal with the threats they face. In countries with low resilience, it is quite easy for organized crime to overwhelm them. But being the first of its kind, it has opened up our eyes for us to look deeper and wider, to understand the causes, the enablers, and the facilitators of organized crime, so that we can begin to dissect these causes, these enablers and facilitators, for us to ensure that we are dealing with them based on the fact that any element of these criminal activities left unattended to could grow to cause even a bigger harm. I am convinced that this is the beginning of the turnaround of countering organized crime in the world. I wish to congratulate the GI-TOC for this important work. I also thank them for associating many experts with this report, which lays a foundation for a better future. Thank you, and I wish you a successful lunch.
The index is, as we have emphasised, a tool designed to spark conversation and debate. As such, we now want to hear from you. We have a series of pre-recorded and live questions about the index, which our panel of Mark, Laura, Lias Tagziria, Senior Analyst at the GI, and I will endeavour to respond to. Our first question comes from Jenny Constantine, who is a researcher and police officer with the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. Over to you, Jenny.
Good morning, everyone. Congratulations on the launch of this necessary and very relevant tool. I have two questions. My first question is, fragile and or failed states such as Venezuela usually have high levels of crime and conflict. So did the research identify if there was any effect on the neighboring states in terms of the reach of organized crime and any new types of organized crime occurring in those neighboring states, such as my country, Trinidad and Tobago, or Guyana?
Thanks for the question, Jenny. To be honest, the index shows quite clearly that there's an impact from conflict states and then in states around them. And as you saw when my colleagues presented, one of the core conclusions is the linkage between the growth of illicit markets and their rooting in conflict and to some degree post-conflict states. And you can see that all over the world. When you look at the data, I think two things have to be said. The first is that it does vary by market. So you need to look at the data in some detail to see the impact between different countries around conflict zones. Many conflict zones have very diverse sets of criminal markets. The DRC or parts of the DRC are a good example. The second is that it depends on the resilience of neighboring states. In the case of Venezuela, I think if you look at the data, and this is really just a quick response to your question, you can see some impacts, for example, around human smuggling in Trinidad and Tobago. You can see an impact in the Grenadines and Grenada around increasing crime levels, which are linked to political instability in Venezuela.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Jenny. Our next question comes from Catarina Aguirre, a researcher from the Igarape Institute in Brazil.
Hi, my name is Caterina Aguirre from Igarape Institute and coordinator of AMASURU, the network of women working in security and defense in Latin America. I have a question for this amazing and innovative report, and it's related with the way you have to consider the impact of the criminal groups that you are analyzing in your report. I want to know if you have a sense, for example, of the concept of domestication of criminal groups, when you could have some countries, for example, when you have high levels of criminality, like Italy, but this country doesn't have like a high rate of criminality or homicides. I wanted to know if you consider in some way this comparison with indicators such as homicide rates or conflict rates. This maybe could be the reason why we have countries such as El Salvador or Guatemala, not with very high levels in the index, but you have, for example, Asia or Spain and France with very high levels of criminality.
Thank you, Caterina. It's a really important point because, of course, violence plays a major role in transnational organized crime all around the world. Within the index, levels of violence are captured in more than one way. So, firstly, the level of violence associated with a market is an important criterion considered by the experts when assigning criminal market scores. So, a cocaine market with very little violence will, all other things equal, score lower than a cocaine market associated with extraordinarily high levels of violence. Violence is also captured in the criminal actors subcomponent. You know, again, levels of violence used by different criminal actor types factor into the scores given by the experts. And in fact, of all the continents, the Americas have the highest criminal actor score overall and the highest mafia-style group score, which is capturing the extreme level of violence witnessed in the region and in particular in Central America. But in terms of the index, a country with extreme levels of violence may still only have one or two extremely pervasive markets, with the rest of the criminal market scoring fairly low, which means that overall they will still have a lower criminality score by the simple law of averages. So it's really those countries with a wide range of different criminal markets and criminal actors who perform a lot worse than countries with only one or two extremely high scoring markets.
Thank you, Lias. Now we cross live to Bangkok to get our next question from Dr. Piset Sayardin. He is the Executive Director at the Thailand Institute of Justice.
Thank you all, and congratulations for the successful launch of an important tool. And I agree with many of you that it's very exciting news. Here in Thailand and at TIJ, we are interested in understanding the root cause of crime, believing that this could be an important entry point when we're trying to reduce the likelihood that many would be involved in the criminality. We see a lot of incidents here in this region as well. So my question or my interest would be to see whether or not you think that the capacity of the state to be able to tackle the criminality of the crime at the root cause would constitute a useful framework when we want to understand its resilience, for instance, in this context. So, and if you think there is a good likelihood that addressing the crime at the root cause would constitute also a good point, what type of data that you think would be useful for data collection and for taking to or incorporating into this already wonderful index? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. So in a word, yes, but it's not so simple. What pushes people to engage in criminal activity obviously varies, but often it is out of necessity or a lack of opportunities. And that was very much part of the rationale that we used when selecting indicators under the index to evaluate resilience. So we have these 12 building blocks of resilience that capture a whole host of factors, including things like economic regulatory capacity, which among other things looks at whether regulations are in place that allow for or hinder private sector business development, all the way to social indicators that look at things like opportunities for community outreach, recognizing that by having safeguards in place to protect vulnerable groups, the need to engage in criminal activities tends to decline. But having said that, one of the things that we've tried to be very clear clear on is that indicators for resilience under the index need to be organized crime specific rather than on broader development issues like poverty, for example. But of course, the issues of organized crime and development are linked, and often so in a vicious cycle. So where there is weak development, conditions like poverty, inequality, and weak infrastructure begin to appear, and this in turn is a breeding ground for organized crime to take advantage and to flourish, which in turn hinders development. So what we've tried to do is really just strike a balance between broader development issues and a specific focus on organized crime, acknowledging that the two are inextricably linked.
Thank you, Dr. Piset, and thank you to Laura. Our next question comes from Dr. Lucia Dammert, professor at the University of Santiago of Chile.
Hi, this is Lucia Dammert from Santiago de Chile. I just want to thank the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime for inviting me to ask a question on this very important document, the Global Organized Crime Index 2021. I think this is a document that will for sure generate some debate around the world, and specifically in Latin America. As the key findings describe, there are some counterintuitive discussions or facts. At least for us in Latin America, we always thought that the Americas were the most violent place in the world. However, one of the key findings is that Asia is the place in which most of the criminality is focused. So also, I believe that for us, that we're suffering a lot of drug trafficking presence, and that's depicted in this report. It's really important to see how human trafficking is, in fact, the most pervasive of all criminal markets globally. So my question for you all is, how can we in Latin America tackle the presence and the consequences of drug trafficking? Would decriminalization be a good way to move forward? Because for almost 2 decades, we have been developing this war on drugs, and the results are basically not good. So in order to tackle violence and the criminal markets that developed under the drug trafficking organizations, do we think that that decriminalization is a good and sound policy decision to take, or should we actually continue with this war on drugs that bring us a lot of violence and not really good results? Thank you.
Lucia, thanks for the question. And of course, the first point to make is that the index measures a range of criminal markets. So that's one reason why Asia, which has a great diversity of criminal markets, or parts of Asia, comes up as a region as having the greatest impact. But if you look at the Latin American scores, of course, you can see the impact that drug trafficking has in that particular region. And if you break down the scores by sub-region, you can also see the impact, particularly in Central America. Now, your question around should the war on drugs be continued, I think the answer and the global consensus is, and increasingly, no. Does that automatically mean that there are easy solutions around reducing the profits that criminal groups make from drugs? I think it's worth, and what the Global Initiative does is provide a platform for many of those discussions. What is clear, I think, from our research work is the urgency of harm reduction measures at lower levels. So the general trend globally for police agencies and others to pick up low-level drug users without targeting higher-level crime bosses, which are more difficult, who may have political protection, who may be engaged in corruption. The index shows quite clearly the degree to which organized crime has penetrated states across the world. So this is one of the key questions, I think, that we hope the index highlights. We hope that it generates debate about possible solutions, and in many ways also widens the debates that take place in Latin America, but which have yet, I think, to gain traction elsewhere in the world.
Thank you for the insights, Mark, and thank you, Lucia, for the question. We've got another question now from Dr. Almir Maljevic, professor at the University of Sarajevo.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alvin Marjevic, and I'm logging in from the University of Sarajevo, Faculty of Criminal Justice Sciences, where I work as a professor of criminal law. Over the past 20 years, I've been dealing with a number of issues related to organized crime, either from the research or from policy perspective. And I have to tell you that I'm really honored that I had an opportunity to read the report about the Global Index Against Organized Crime, Global Organized Crime Index at this very, very early stage. I have to say that I'm very impressed with the work that the team has put forward, and I would like to use this opportunity to congratulate the team for the work they've done. We all know how difficult it is to measure or assess any type of crime, and organized crime in particular. And to that end, I really have to comment the team for the work they've put together in the past 2 years. As the authors put it in the report, the challenges that they've been faced with were the challenges of availability of data, reliability of data, uniformity and compatibility of data. And to sort of counter those challenges, they've tried to do a number of cross-checks with various experts and to use proxy indicators for a number of variables. From my point of view, what I would like to ask is the following, and the question is related to the authors of the report. Would the report profit, or would the scores profit from maybe finding a way to assess or to score reliability of the index itself? So if in certain countries we have better data, if we have readily available experts who can cross-check the information, then it might be that the reliability of the score or index for a particular country is higher than for the other. And just for the sake of better understanding of the report, I think it could be potentially beneficial to have this differentiation introduced.
Thank you for your question. So our index is a fairly unique index in that it's an expert-led assessment. So the scores for each of the 26 indicators are determined by experts. You know, organized crime is such a complex phenomenon that we felt that simply putting together an index using quantitative data alone would not be capable of capturing the complexity and the nuance of the world of organized crime. We felt that we needed experts to really interpret the data that's out there. But obviously with expert-led assessments, there is always going to be some degree of subjectivity, which we have tried to minimize in a number of different ways. So from the very beginning, we had a standardized set of data that was collected for each country, which the experts then relied upon in part when determining their scores. We also had a set of scoring thresholds with associated descriptions and criteria for each score from 1 to 10, as well as a defined set of guiding questions to indicate what kind of information the experts were supposed to assess. And speaking more specifically to the issue of information gaps and reliability, experts were also asked to provide a confidence level for each of the indicators on a scale of 1 to 10, indicating how confident they were in their own knowledge. And then these confidence levels allowed us to identify areas with more information gaps, which we then sought to fill with further research. Thank you.
Thank you, Lias. Our next question is from Dr. Natalia Ollis, Director of the European Institute for Crime Prevention and Control, that's affiliated with the United Nations.
First of all, let me congratulate the Global Initiative on this extremely interesting and important report. The Organized Crime Index presents a sophisticated and comprehensive analysis and account of organized crime around the globe with nuanced and detailed analysis. Having worked with the issue of human trafficking for a number of years and on different continents, it was important to learn that human trafficking is the most pervasive criminal market globally. In the report, you also note that the vast majority of victims of human trafficking are women and girls. However, the report does not explicitly address the gendered structural causes and consequences of human trafficking, nor does it suggest remedies that would consider the gendered impacts of organized crime in more general. My question, therefore, is how do you see that the enhancement of gender equality and gender-specific measures should be incorporated into the response of organized crime globally?
Thank you so much, Natalia, for the very interesting question, and forgive me for abusing my privilege as the moderator to respond. The question of gender and the way we view gender dynamics in organized crime is complex and massively understudied. And so while it was the goal for us, whilst defining and gathering data for the foundations of the index, to be gender sensitive and use gender disaggregated data as much as possible, frankly, the evidence basis doesn't really help us. So where we will move forward over the course of the next 2 years in continuing to do analysis on the data we have, which will try and tease out gender dynamics. A lot of our insights into the way that gender and organized crime interplay comes from our qualitative research, those and that of others, utilizing the civil society observatories and networks that the GI has across the world. I think it's worth saying that there is a compelling reason to study gender and to use a gender lens when analyzing issues of organized crime. We've seen the growing role of women as active protagonists and strategic members of criminal networks rising increasingly up the ranks, often in particular in response to enforcement efforts. We've seen, as you have mentioned yourself, how important and how often it is that women and girls are the victims of criminal enterprises and criminal exploitation and abuse. But I think more importantly, through our work with the Resilience Fund, which is a mechanism to support grassroots civil society actors that the GI runs, we've seen that women are actually a source of resilience, that as a programming response to the most harmful impacts of organized crime, they have a role to play as change agents, as advocates, and as first responders, as Laura said in her presentation. So while the index hasn't well answered a lot of the questions around gender, we hope, as we say, that this is a catalyst to asking the questions and that in future iterations we'll have better data and more basis on which to respond. So turning to our final question on the report, we're going to hear from Lansana Geberi, a consultant at the Open Society Initiative for West Africa.
My name is Lansana Geberi. I'm honored to participate in the launch of this important report. According to the report, Africa has the highest levels of criminality overall, scoring 5.17, just behind Asia on the criminality scale. Africa is also identified by experts as having the least developed mechanisms and institutional frameworks to counter organized crime. Please highlight best practices of capacity building and technical assistance that will help reduce the vulnerability of poor nations and to increase resilience, including in the form of targeted organized crime strategies, resourcing law enforcement bodies, and the building of institutional and economic frameworks, among others, to reduce this kind of vulnerability. Thank you very much.
Lansana, thank you very much for the question. I think the first point I want to make is we hope that one of the key conclusions or outcomes that can be drawn from the index relates indeed to the delivery of technical assistance, so both to its prioritization geographically and also by sector. And if you're talking about poorer countries or countries with weaker institutions, I think that the index says some quite interesting things. The first, in my view, and we try to measure this as you are aware, is the importance of political will. So this idea that responses to organized crime, particularly institutional government style responses, are much less effective when there's not political will to protect them, to push them forward, and indeed to protect the officials that then have to engage in activities against organized crime. The second issue, and that applies, I think, in developing countries or countries with weaker institutions or governance, is that there's no silver bullet. That not only is it institutional strengthening that is required, but a range of other mechanisms or forms of partnership might be useful in addressing organized crime. And to name a few, issue of developing civil society, promoting preventive responses, and also supporting free media, so reporting on organized crime in a transparent way to call out, if you like, key criminal actors. Now, all of that, I think, has a question of timing. A lot of this relates to the nature of political systems, the degree to which the state may be involved, the degree to which criminal actors may be linked to politics, etc. But it does suggest that a set of responses are needed, and that timing, that when the interventions come into play, should be seriously considered. And if you look at the data around specific countries, I think you can draw out some interesting conclusions. Thanks, Lansana.
That's all we have time for today with the launch of the Global Organized Crime Index. If I may, on behalf of the Global Initiative Against Organized Crime, offer again our thanks to everyone who's joined us today and for everyone who posed thoughtful comments or questions. I'd like to thank our donors, the governments of the United States, of Norway and the EU for their funding and the support of the initiative and the work that we've done. Thank you to all the experts who have participated in developing the tool, contributing their expertise at various stages of data gathering and analysis. And of course to our core team who have worked together to build the index, our colleagues at Café Art Brazil who built the interactive website and laid out the report. We hope that everyone who's joined us has found this event as compelling and thought-provoking as we have, and that it will be and has been a catalyst for further debate about how we can prevent organised crime and support resilience moving forward. We encourage you to please check out the full report for the 2021 Global Organised Crime Index in more detail by going to our website or to www.ocindex.net, where the website and the report can be downloaded and explored. Thank you all very much for joining us. Goodbye.